License and registration. You crossed the center line. Have you had anything to drink tonight?
My wallet's in my back pocket and documents in the glove box, so I'll move slowly.
No, sir. May I ask the reason for the stop?
Where are you coming from?
The rhythmic, unyielding thud of the windshield wipers was the only sound keeping Marcus tethered to reality. It was 2:15 in the morning on a rain-swept Thursday, and the dashboard clock glowed with a harsh, neon green intensity that stung his exhausted eyes. Marcus, a 24-year-old second-year law student, was navigating his 10-year-old Honda Civic through the dimly lit, slick streets of a city that had long since gone to sleep. He was running on 3 hours of rest, a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee, and the lingering adrenaline of a grueling 14-hour study session dissecting appellate court decisions for his upcoming criminal procedure final. His mind was a chaotic jumble of case law, statutes, and legal doctrines, but his immediate focus was entirely on the road, watching the asphalt blur under the hazy glow of the streetlights. As he rounded a curve on an unfamiliar stretch of a transitional neighborhood, an area characterized by shuttered storefronts and gentrifying apartment complexes, a massive, water-filled pothole materialized in his lane. Reacting on pure instinct, Marcus smoothly adjusted the steering wheel, his tires briefly crossing the solid yellow dividing line for a fraction of a second before he corrected his trajectory and settled back into his lane. It was a minor, everyday maneuver, the kind born of necessity on poorly maintained municipal roads. But in the stark silence of the night, it was enough. A heartbeat later, the interior of his sedan was violently illuminated by an explosion of flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the rearview mirror. An involuntary jolt of cold adrenaline surged through Marcus's chest. The physiological response was immediate and overwhelming. His heart rate spiked against his ribs, his mouth went instantly dry, and the familiar, suffocating weight of anxiety settled heavily onto his shoulders. He was a young black man driving alone late at night in an older, slightly battered vehicle. He knew the statistics, he knew the stories. He knew the cold, hard reality that existed entirely separate from the sterile, theoretical discussions of justice in his law school lecture halls. Pulling over to the shoulder with deliberate slowness, Marcus initiated the mental checklist he had been taught since he was old enough to reach the pedals. He shifted the car into park, turned off the engine, removed the keys from the ignition, and placed them visibly on the dashboard. He turned on the interior dome light, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare over the worn upholstery, and rolled down his window, letting the cold, damp night air wash over his face. He placed both hands firmly at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension, and waited. Through the side mirror, he watched the silhouette of a police cruiser idling behind him. 2 doors opened. The officers approached cautiously, one on the driver's side, the other flanking the passenger side, their flashlights cutting aggressively through the dark and the rain, sweeping over the trunk, the back seat, and finally directly into Marcus's eyes. Officer Miller was a 12-year veteran of the force, a man whose career had been built on a foundation of street-level instincts and a deeply ingrained, though rarely spoken, set of assumptions. He was tired, his uniform was damp, and his patience was thin. To Miller, the variables presented a familiar, suspicious equation. An older, beat-up car, a young black male driver, an evasive maneuver crossing the center line, and a neighborhood known for late-night narcotics trafficking. In his mind, the narrative was already written before he even reached the driver's window. Standing slightly behind the B-pillar to maintain a tactical advantage, Miller directed the blinding beam of his heavy maglite straight at Marcus's face. "Good evening," Miller said, his voice flat, devoid of any conversational warmth, carrying the heavy, practiced authority of a man accustomed to unquestioned compliance. "License, registration, and proof of insurance." Marcus squinted against the harsh light, his voice tight but remarkably steady. "Good evening, officer. My license is in my wallet in my back right pocket, and the registration is in the glove compartment. I have to reach for them. Is that all right?" It was a polite, standard request designed to eliminate any ambiguity about his movements. Miller kept the light pinned on him. "Go ahead, slow movements." As Marcus carefully shifted his weight to retrieve his wallet, his mind automatically analyzed the encounter. He knew that the initial traffic stop, triggered by the momentary crossing of the yellow line, constituted a seizure under the Fourth Amendment, but it was legally justified by the traffic violation, regardless of the officer's actual underlying motives. This was the doctrine established in Warren versus United States, a case he had briefed just weeks prior. The Supreme Court had ruled that an officer's subjective intent for pulling someone over is irrelevant as long as there is an objective legal basis for the stop, even a minor traffic infraction. Miller had the legal right to stop him. Marcus handed the documents through the rain-streaked window, Miller barely glanced at them before looking back at Marcus, his expression hardened by an unyielding skepticism. "You know why I stopped you tonight?" Miller asked, employing the classic, open-ended question designed to elicit a confession or a nervous stumble. "No, sir, I don't," Marcus replied honestly, keeping his hands visible. "You swerved over the center line back there, failure to maintain your lane. You been drinking tonight?" The accusation hung in the heavy air. "No, sir, I was just avoiding a large pothole." Miller's flashlight swept the interior again, illuminating the fast food wrappers on the floorboard and the heavy, expensive-looking leather satchel resting on the passenger seat. "Where are you coming from at this hour?" Miller asked, his tone shifting from routine inquiry to an active interrogation. The question was standard, but the underlying assumption was thick and suffocating. Marcus felt a flicker of frustration, but he suppressed it, maintaining an even, respectful demeanor. "I'm coming from the law library at the university. I was studying for finals." He said it plainly, hoping the mundane reality of his night would diffuse the tension. Instead, the answer seemed to have the opposite effect. Miller's eyes narrowed, the flashlight beam holding steady on Marcus's face. In Miller's mental framework, law students drove newer cars. They didn't live in this part of town. They didn't look like Marcus did, exhausted and wearing a faded, oversized college hoodie. The truth did not fit the officer's predetermined profile, and therefore, in his mind, it had to be a lie. A lie indicated deception, and deception indicated criminal activity. This was the insidious nature of implicit bias. It wasn't manifested in overt racial slurs or cartoonish villainy, but in the quiet, subtle discounting of a man's reality simply because it contradicted a flawed, deeply rooted heuristic. "Law library, right," Miller said, the sarcasm dripping from his voice. "Step out of the vehicle for me." Marcus's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his sternum. He knew his rights. Under Pennsylvania versus Mims, a police officer can legally order a driver out of a vehicle during a lawful traffic stop for officer safety, without needing any additional suspicion. Complying was not optional. It was the law. "Okay," Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave as he reached for the door handle. He stepped out into the cold, driving rain, instantly shivering as the chill bit through his sweatshirt. He stood by the open door, tall but entirely vulnerable, the flashing lights painting his face in alternating shades of crimson and blue. Officer Davis, the younger rookie on the passenger side, moved closer, his hand resting instinctively on his duty belt, feeding off his senior partner's escalated energy. "Turn around and face the car," Miller barked. Marcus complied, placing his hands flat on the wet roof of the Civic. He felt Miller approach from behind. "I'm going to pat you down for weapons," Miller announced, already reaching for Marcus's waist. Marcus took a shallow breath, the cold metal of the car biting into his palms. He knew the legal threshold here intimately. A Terry frisk, a pat-down of the outer clothing, requires specific, articulable facts that lead the officer to reasonably believe the suspect is armed and dangerous. A minor traffic violation and a perceived bad attitude did not meet that threshold. "Officer," Marcus said, his voice trembling slightly but his articulation precise, "I am not armed. I am not dangerous. I do not consent to any searches of my person or my vehicle." It was the legally correct phrase, the shield the Constitution supposedly provided him. But on the dark, wet asphalt, the assertion of his constitutional rights acted not as a shield, but as an accelerant. To Miller, invoking the Fourth Amendment was the ultimate red flag, a defiant act that practically screamed guilt. "I didn't ask for your consent," Miller snapped, aggressively running his hands down Marcus's legs, patting his pockets with unnecessary force. "You're acting nervous. You're sweating. You're telling me you're a law student driving around this neighborhood at 2 a.m. I'm conducting a protective sweep." He found nothing on Marcus. No weapons, no contraband, just a cell phone and a set of keys. Frustrated by the lack of physical evidence to justify his escalating suspicions, Miller stepped back, his flashlight now pointed directly at the closed trunk of the Civic. The procedural errors began to compound, shifting from aggressive policing into blatant constitutional violations. "What's in the trunk?" Miller demanded. "Just my books and some clothes," Marcus replied, keeping his hands firmly on the roof. "I'm going to need to take a look inside," Miller stated, framing it as an imperative rather than a request. Marcus shook his head slightly, rainwater dripping from his chin. "Officer, as I stated, I do not consent to a search of my vehicle. You pulled me over for a traffic violation. You have my information. There is no probable cause to search my car." He was quoting the textbook, pleading with the system to operate the way it was written on paper. But Miller had already committed to his narrative. He needed a bridge, a legal fiction to cross the chasm from an unfounded hunch to probable cause. "I smell marijuana," Miller declared suddenly, looking over at his rookie partner for confirmation. "You smell that, Davis?" Davis, eager to back up his veteran partner, hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Yeah, faint, but it's there." Faint. But Marcus felt a cold dread wash over him. It was a complete fabrication. He didn't smoke, he had asthma, and the interior of his car smelled faintly of stale coffee and old paper. But he knew the devastating power of those three words. The smell of marijuana was the master key, the subjective, unprovable assertion that routinely unlocked the Fourth Amendment and dismantled a citizen's right to privacy. "I don't smoke," Marcus said, his voice rising in desperation. "There is no marijuana in that car. You are fabricating probable cause." Miller's demeanor instantly hardened into absolute hostility. "All right, that's it. Put your hands behind your back." Miller grabbed Marcus's left wrist, twisting it sharply and forcefully pulling it behind him. Marcus gasped in pain as the unnatural angle strained his shoulder joint. "Stop resisting," Miller shouted, a command often yelled not for the benefit of the suspect, but for the audio recording of the body camera, creating a preemptive narrative of an uncooperative subject. "I'm not resisting," Marcus cried out, trying to loosen the tension in his arm. But Miller drove a knee into the back of Marcus's thigh, forcing him off balance and down onto the unforgiving wet pavement. The impact knocked the breath out of Marcus. The rough asphalt tore through his jeans, scraping his knee to the bone. Before he could recover, Miller aggressively yanked his right arm back, applying crushing pressure to his wrist as the heavy metal handcuffs ratcheted shut, biting deeply into the flesh. In the forceful, adrenaline-fueled motion, Marcus heard a distinct, sickening pop in his right wrist, followed immediately by a blinding flash of white-hot pain. He let out an involuntary scream, his face pressed against the oily, wet street. He had just sustained a severe fracture to his scaphoid bone and a torn ligament in his dominant hand, a catastrophic injury for a student who needed to type comprehensive, timed law school exams in mere weeks. He lay there on the ground, the freezing rain soaking through to his skin, gasping for air as the officers stood over him. "Suspect detained," Miller barked into his shoulder radio. "Requesting a K-9 unit to my location. I've got a drug odor on a vehicle and a combative subject." What followed was an agonizing display of procedural breakdown and constitutional negligence. Marcus, handcuffed and shivering on the curb, his right hand throbbing with a sickening intensity, was forced to watch as the officers effectively dismantled his life based on a lie. The law was clear on this matter as well. In Rodriguez versus United States, the Supreme Court held that police officers may not extend the length of a traffic stop to conduct a dog sniff without reasonable, articulable suspicion of criminal activity beyond the initial traffic violation. The fabrication of the marijuana smell was their weak justification, but the reality was that they had no legitimate reason to hold him. They waited for 45 minutes in the freezing rain for the K-9 unit to arrive from across the city. For 45 minutes, Marcus sat on the concrete, his constitutional rights suspended by the arbitrary authority of a man acting on an unchecked bias. When the dog finally arrived, it performed a perimeter sweep and, unsurprisingly to anyone familiar with the high rate of false positive alerts driven by handler cues, indicated on the trunk. The subsequent search was invasive and humiliating. The officers tore through his vehicle, dumping the contents of his heavy leather satchel onto the wet hood of the cruiser. His meticulously highlighted casebooks, contracts, property, constitutional law, tumbled out, the pages instantly soaking up the rainwater, the ink bleeding into illegible streaks. They opened his trunk, tearing apart his gym bag, throwing his clean clothes onto the dirty street. They searched the glove box, under the seats, in the console. They searched for the phantom narcotics, for the hidden weapons, for the validation of Officer Miller's profound prejudice. They found absolutely nothing. There were no drugs, there were no guns, there was only the mundane, heartbreaking evidence of a young man trying to build a future, now scattered and ruined on the wet asphalt. When the search finally concluded, yielding nothing but embarrassment and destruction, the officers were faced with a dilemma. They had severely injured a citizen, destroyed his property, and illegally prolonged a detention, all for a minor traffic infraction that they hadn't even written a ticket for yet. To justify the escalation, to cover the glaring procedural errors, they did what was standard practice in such scenarios. They arrested Marcus. They hauled him into the back of the cruiser, his broken wrist throbbing in the tight cuffs, and transported him to the precinct, charging him with disorderly conduct and resisting arrest, the catch-all charges utilized when the police need to legitimize an unlawful use of force. Marcus spent 24 agonizing hours in a holding cell, missing his criminal procedure final, his academic future suddenly thrown into extreme jeopardy. His wrist swelled to twice its normal size, turning a dark mottled purple, yet he was denied medical attention until he was finally released on his own recognizance the following evening. The charges, baseless and unsupported by any actual evidence of a crime, were quietly dismissed by the district attorney's office a week later in a brief, unceremonious email. The criminal justice system, having chewed him up, simply spat him out and expected him to walk away grateful for his freedom. But Marcus was a law student. He understood the profound difference between being a victim of circumstance and being a victim of systemic deprivation of civil rights. He didn't just walk away. He meticulously documented every bruise, every medical bill, and every destroyed textbook. He hired a formidable civil rights attorney named Sarah Jenkins, a woman known for tearing apart police narratives with surgical precision. Together, they filed a federal lawsuit under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, alleging unlawful detention, unreasonable search and seizure in violation of the Fourth Amendment, and excessive use of force. The turning point in the litigation, the moment the balance of power fundamentally shifted, occurred during the grueling discovery phase, specifically during the deposition of Officer Miller. The setting was a stark contrast to the chaotic, rain-soaked street where the incident began. It was a sterile, aggressively air-conditioned conference room high up in a glass and steel downtown skyscraper, the mahogany table polished to a mirror finish. Miller sat in a slightly too tight suit, looking deeply uncomfortable under the harsh fluorescent lights, flanked by the city's anxious defense attorneys. Sarah Jenkins, armed with the undeniable, objective truth captured by the officer's own body cameras, systematically dismantled the illusion of Miller's policing. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse him of overt racism. Instead, she cornered him with his own procedural failures. She played the audio from Officer Davis's body camera, isolating the crucial seconds before Miller claimed he smelled marijuana. The high-definition audio picked up Davis quietly sighing, his body language relaxed, showing absolutely no physical indication of detecting a strong, localized odor of narcotics until prompted by his superior officer. Sarah meticulously went through the timeline, establishing that the 52-minute detention between the initial stop and the arrival of the K-9 unit was a blatant violation of the Rodriguez standard. She cross-examined Miller on his training and experience, forcing him to articulate exactly what specific, objective facts made him suspect a man who immediately complied with orders, provided valid documentation, and had no criminal record. Miller stammered, falling back on vague generalities about the neighborhood and Marcus's demeanor, excuses that sounded incredibly hollow and deeply prejudiced when spoken aloud in a quiet room, stripped of the adrenaline and authority of a police badge. But the most damning piece of evidence was the medical documentation of Marcus's shattered wrist and the dashcam footage showing the precise, brutal moment it happened. The video clearly showed Marcus standing still, offering no physical resistance, calmly stating his lack of consent before Miller aggressively threw him to the ground. It wasn't a fight, it was an assault perpetrated under the color of law. The city's legal team, recognizing the catastrophic exposure of taking such a horrific, clearly documented violation of civil rights to a jury, desperately wanted to avoid a public trial. They knew that a jury would not just see a mistake, they would see a systemic failure, a terrifying reality where a young man's knowledge of his constitutional rights was the very thing that provoked a violent assault by the people sworn to protect those rights. 3 months before the trial date, after days of intense, closed-door mediation, the city capitulated. They agreed to a massive $3.2 million civil settlement, a staggering sum designed to make the problem quietly disappear. The settlement would cover Marcus's extensive surgeries, his rigorous physical therapy, the delay in his legal education, and the profound, lingering psychological trauma of the event. It was heralded in the local papers as a massive victory for civil rights, a triumphant example of the justice system ultimately working to correct its own catastrophic errors. Yet, as Marcus sat in his lawyer's office, staring down at the multi-million-dollar check resting on the desk, he felt a profound, hollow emptiness instead of victory. He looked down at his right hand, heavily scarred from the surgical pins required to reconstruct his scaphoid bone, knowing it would never possess the same strength or dexterity again. He had won the lawsuit, but the victory felt entirely retroactive, a financial bandage applied long after the foundational damage had been done. The money didn't erase the terrifying memory of his face pressed against the cold, wet asphalt, feeling the crushing weight of a system that viewed him not as a citizen to be protected, but as a threat to be neutralized based on nothing but assumptions. It didn't change the fact that Officer Miller was still on the force, perhaps slightly more cautious, but fundamentally unchanged in his worldview. It didn't alter the terrifying reality that the Constitution, the very document Marcus had dedicated his life to studying and upholding, was ultimately just words printed on paper, entirely powerless on a dark street unless the people enforcing the law chose to respect them. As he picked up the pen with his weakened hand to sign the final release forms, Marcus was left grappling with a chilling realization that extended far beyond his own ordeal, prompting a question that every citizen must eventually face in the dark of night. What good are your constitutional rights if knowing them, asserting them, and relying on them is the exact thing that gets you brutalized?